Praise the Lord. Welcome to About Missionaries channel. My name is Peter J. Today we're going to discuss the New Testament hero Apostle Paul. Saint Paul the Apostle, original name Saul of Tarsus, born 4 BCE. Tarsus in Cilicia, now in Turkey, died c. 62 to 64 CE. Rome, Italy, one of the leaders of the first generations of Christians. Often considered to be the most important person after Jesus the history of Christianity. In this day, although he was a major figure within the very small Christian movement, he also had many enemies and detractors, and his contemporaries probably did not accord his as much respect as they gave Peter and James. Paul was compelled to struggle, therefore, to establish his worth and authority. His surviving letters, however, have had an enormous influence on subsequent Christianity and secure his place as one of the greatest religious leader of all time. Some of the sources regarding Saint Paul the Apostle. Of the 27 books in the New Testament, 13 are attributed to Paul, and approximately half of another, Acts of the Apostles, deals with Paul's life and works. Thus, about half of the New Testament stems from Paul and the people whom he influenced. Only 7 of the 13 letters, however, can be accepted as being entirely authentic, dictated by Paul himself. Although frequently useful, the information in Acts is second-hand, and it is sometimes in direct conflict with the letters. The 7 undoubted letters constitute the best source of information on Paul's life and especially his thought, in the order in which they appear in the New Testament. They are Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. The probable chronological order, leaving aside Philemon, which cannot be dated, is 1 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, and Romans. Letters considered Deutero-Pauline, probably written by Paul's followers after his death, are Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians. 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus are Trito-Pauline, probably written by members of the Pauline school a generation after his death. Paul was a Greek-speaking Jew from Asia Minor. His birthplace, Tarsus, was a major city in eastern Cilicia, a region that had been made part of the Roman province of Syria by the time of Paul's adulthood. 2 of the main cities of Syria, Damascus, and Antioch, played a prominent part in his life and letters. Although the exact date of his birth is unknown, he was active as a missionary in the 40s and 50s of the 1st century CE. In his childhood and youth Paul learned how to work with his own hands, reference 1 Corinthians 4:12. His trade, tent making, which he continued to practice after his conversion to Christianity, helps to explain important aspects of his apostleship. He could travel with a few leather working tools and set up shop anywhere. It is doubtful that his family was wealthy or aristocratic, but since he found it noteworthy that he sometimes worked with his own hands, it may be assumed that he was not a common laborer. His letters are written in Koine or Common Greek rather than in the elegant literary Greek of his wealthy contemporary, the Jewish philosopher Philo-Judaeus of Alexandria, and this too argues against the view that Paul was an aristocrat. Moreover, he knew how to dictate and he could write his hand in large letters, Galatians 6:11, though not in the small near letters of the professional scribe. Until about the midpoint of his life, Paul was a member of the Pharisees, a religious party that emerged during the later Second Temple period. What little is known about Paul the Pharisee reflects the character of the Pharisaic movement. Pharisees believed in life after death, which was one of Paul's deepest convictions. They accepted non-biblical traditions as being about as important as the written Bible. Paul refers to his expertise in traditions, Galatians 1:14. Pharisees were very careful students of the Hebrew Bible, and Paul was able to quote extensively from the Greek translation. It was fairly easy for a bright, ambitious young boy to memorize the Bible, and it would have been very difficult and expensive for Paul as an adult to carry around dozens of bulky scrolls. By his own account, Paul was the best Jew and the best Pharisee of his generation, Philippians 3:4-6, Galatians 1:13-14, though he claimed to be the last apostle of Christ, 2 Corinthians 11:22-3, 1 Corinthians 15:9-10, and attributed his successes to the grace of God. Paul spent much of the first half of his life persecuting the nascent Christian movement, an activity to which he refers several times. Paul's motivations are unknown, but they seem not to have been connected to his Pharisaism. The chief persecutors of the Christian movement in Jerusalem were the high priest and his associates, who were Sadducees, if they belonged to one of the parties, and Acts depicts the leading Pharisee, Gamaliel, as defending the Christians, Acts 5:34. It is possible that Paul believed that Jewish converts to the new movement were not sufficiently observant of the Jewish law, that Jewish converts mingled too freely with Gentile, non-Jewish, converts, thus associating themselves with idolatrous practices, or that the notion of a crucified Messiah was objectionable. The young Paul certainly would have rejected the view that Jesus had been raised after his death, not because he doubted resurrection as such but because he would not have believed that God chose to favor Jesus by raising him before the time of the judgment of the world. Whatever his reasons, Paul's persecutions probably involved traveling from synagogue to synagogue and urging the punishment of Jews who accepted Jesus as the Messiah. Disobedient members of synagogues were punished by some form of ostracism or by light flogging, which Paul himself later suffered at least 5 times, 2 Corinthians 11:24, though he does not say when or where. According to Acts, Paul began his persecutions in Jerusalem, a view at odds with his assertion that he did not know any of the Jerusalem followers of Christ until well after his conversion, Galatians 1:4-17. Paul was on his way to Damascus when he had a vision that changed his life. According to Galatians 1:16, God revealed his Son to him. More specifically, Paul states that he saw the Lord, 1 Corinthians 9:1, though Acts claims that near Damascus he saw a blinding bright light. Following this revelation, which convinced Paul that God had indeed chosen Jesus to be the promised Messiah, he went into Arabia, probably Coel Syria, west of Damascus, Galatians 1:17. He then returned to Damascus, and 3 years later he went to Jerusalem to become acquainted with the leading apostles there. After this meeting he began his famous missions to the west, preaching first in his native Syria and Cilicia, Galatians 1:17-24. During the next 20 years or so, c. mid-30s to mid-50s, he established several churches in Asia Minor and at least 3 in Europe, including the church at Corinth. During his missions, Paul realized that his preaching to Gentiles was creating difficulties for the Christians in Jerusalem, who thought that Gentiles must become Jewish to join the Christian movement. To settle the issue, Paul returned to Jerusalem and struck a deal. It was agreed that Peter would be the principal apostle to Jews and Paul the principal apostle to Gentiles. Paul would not have to change his message, but he would take up a collection for the Jerusalem church, which required financial support, Galatians 2:1-10, 2 Corinthians 8:9, Romans 15:16-17, 25-26, though Paul's Gentile churches were hardly well off. In Romans 15:16-17 Paul seems to interpret the offering of the Gentiles symbolically, suggesting that it is the prophesied Gentile pilgrimage to the Temple of Jerusalem, with their wealth in their hands, for example, Isaiah 61:6. It is also obvious that Paul and the Jerusalem apostles made a political bargain not to interfere in each other's spheres. The circumcision faction of the Jerusalem apostles, Galatians 2:12-13, which argued that converts should undergo circumcision as a sign of accepting the covenant between God and Abraham, later broke this agreement by preaching to the Gentile converts both in Antioch, Galatians 2:12, and Galatia and insisting that they be circumcised, leading to some of Paul's strongest invective, Galatians 1:7-9, 3:1, 5:2-12, 6:12-13. In the late 50s, Paul returned to Jerusalem with the money he had raised and a few of his Gentile converts. There he was arrested for taking a Gentile too far into the temple precincts, and, after a series of trials, he was sent to Rome. Later Christian tradition favors the view that he was executed there, 1 Clement 5:1-7, perhaps as part of the executions of Christians ordered by the Roman Emperor Nero following the Great Fire in the city in 64 CE. That his vision proved that Jesus lived in heaven, that Jesus was the Messiah and God's Son, and that he would soon return. Moreover, Paul thought that the purpose of this revelation was his appointment to preach among the Gentiles, Galatians 1:16. By the time of his last extant letter, Romans, he could clearly describe his place in God's plan. The Hebrew prophets, he wrote, had predicted that in days to come God would restore the tribes of Israel and that the Gentiles would then turn to worship the one true God. Paul maintained that his place in this scheme was to win the Gentiles, both Greeks and barbarians, the common term for non-Greeks at the time, Romans 1:14. Inasmuch then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I glorify my ministry to make my people jealous and thus save some of them, Romans 11:13-14. In 2 other places in Romans 11 verses, 25-26, the full number of the Gentiles will come in and thus all Israel will be saved, and 30-31. By the mercy shown to you, they too may now receive mercy. Paul asserts that he would save some of Israel indirectly, through jealousy, and that Jews would be brought to Christ because of the successful Gentile mission. Thus, Paul's view reversed the traditional understanding of God's plan, according to which Israel would be restored before the Gentiles were converted. Whereas Peter, James, and John, the chief apostles to the circumcised, Galatians 2:6-10, had been relatively unsuccessful, God had led Paul through Asia Minor and Greece in triumph and had used him to spread the fragrance. Now topic about St. Paul the Apostle travels and letters. During the first 2 centuries of the Roman Empire, travel was safer than it would be again until the suppression of pirates in the 19th century. Paul and his companions sometimes traveled by ship, but much of the time they walked, probably beside a donkey carrying tools, clothes, and perhaps some scrolls. Occasionally they had plenty, but often they were hungry, ill-clad, and cold, Philippians 4:11-12, 2 Corinthians 11:27, and at times they had to rely on the charity of their converts. Paul wanted to keep pressing west and therefore only occasionally had the opportunity to revisit his churches. He tried to keep up his converts' spirits, answer their questions, and resolve their problems by letter and by sending one or more of his assistants, especially Timothy and Titus. Paul's letters reveal a remarkable human being, dedicated, compassionate, emotional, sometimes harsh and angry, clever and quick-witted, supple in argumentation, and above all possessing a soaring, passionate commitment to God, Jesus Christ, and his mission. Fortunately, after his death, one of his followers collected some of the letters, edited them very slightly, and published them. They constitute one of history's most remarkable personal contributions to religious thought and practice. Despite Paul's intemperate outburst in 1 Corinthians, women should be silent in the churches. 14:34-36 Women played a large part in his missionary endeavor. Chloe was an important member of the church in Corinth, 1 Corinthians 1:11, and Phoebe was a deacon and a benefactor of Paul and others, Romans 16:1-2. Romans 16 names 8 other women active in the Christian movement, including Eunia, prominent among the apostles, Mary, who has worked very hard among you, and Julia. Women were frequently among the major supporters of new religious movements, and Christianity was no exception. Although in his view Paul was the true and authoritative apostle to the Gentiles, chosen for the task from his mother's womb, Galatians 1:15-16, 2:7-8, Romans 11:13-14, he was only one of several missionaries spawned by the early Christian movement. Some of the other Christian workers must have been quite important. Indeed, an unknown minister of Christ established the church in Rome before Paul arrived in the city. Paul treated some of these possible competitors, such as Prisca, Aquila, Eunia, and Andronicus, in a very friendly manner, Romans 16:3-7, while he looked on others with suspicion or hostility. He was especially wary of Apollos, a Christian missionary known to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 3:1-22, and he vilified competitors in Corinth as false apostles and ministers of Satan, 2 Corinthians 11. He called down God's curse on competing preachers in Galatia, Galatians 1:6-9, and asserted that some of the Christians in Jerusalem were false brothers, Galatians 2:4, compare 2 Corinthians 11:26. Only in the latter 2 cases, however, is the nature of the disagreement known. Paul's competitors opposed his admitting Gentiles to the Christian movement without requiring them to become Jewish. The polemical sections of Paul's letters have been used in Christian controversies ever since. The basic message from St. Paul the Apostle. In the surviving letters, Paul often recalls what he said during his founding visits. He preached the death, resurrection, and lordship of Jesus Christ, and he proclaimed that faith in Jesus guarantees a share in his life. Writing to the Galatians, he reminded them it was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly exhibited as crucified, Galatians 3:1, and writing to the Corinthians he recalled that he had known nothing among them except Jesus Christ, and him crucified, 1 Corinthians 2:2. According to Paul, Jesus' death was not a defeat but was for the believer's benefit. In accord with ancient sacrificial theology, Jesus' death substituted for that of others and thereby freed believers from sin and guilt, Romans 3:23-25. The second interpretation of Christ's death appears in Galatians and Romans. Those who are baptized into Christ are baptized into his death, and thus they escape the power of sin, for example, Romans 6. In the first case, Jesus died so that the believer's sins will be purged. In the second, he died so that the believers may die with him and consequently live with him. These 2 ideas coincide, see below Christology. The resurrection of Christ was also of primary importance, as Paul revealed in his letter to the Thessalonians, the earliest surviving account of conversion to the Christian movement. Written to Thessalonica and Macedonia possibly as early as 41 CE and no later than 51, thus no more than 20 years after Jesus' death, The letter states, 1 Thessalonians 1:9-10, "For the people of those regions report about us what kind of welcome we had among you, and how you turned to God from idols, to serve a living and true God, and to wait for His Son from heaven, whom He raised from the dead, Jesus, who rescues us from the wrath that is coming." Since Jesus was raised and still lives, He could return to rescue believers at the time of the final judgment. The resurrection is connected to the third major emphasis, the promise of salvation to believers. Paul taught that those who died in Christ would be raised when He returned, while those still alive would be caught up in the clouds together with them to meet the Lord in the air. 1 Thessalonians 4:14-18. These and many other passages reveal the essence of the Christian message. 1. God sent His Son. 2. The Son was crucified and resurrected for the benefit of humanity. 3. The Son would soon return. And 4. Those who belong to the Son would live with Him forever. Paul's gospel, like those of others, also included 5. The admonition to live by the highest moral standard, "May your spirit and soul and body be kept sound and blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ." 1 Thessalonians 5:23.